Good evening, good day, everybody. Welcome to the 13th edition of the Dasra Philanthropy Week. While the last decade has given us great reason to celebrate our economic progress as a country, the devastating pandemic has forced us to confront our current reality. There are two stark realities: becoming one of the world's fastest growing major economies called India, and the other called Bharat, where 400 million realities have become the largest number of extreme poor globally. With this backdrop and the fresh wounds of the COVID war, this year's forum focuses on continuity, community, and convergence, sharing learnings for collaborative action for greater continuity, keeping communities at the center, and forcing convergence towards inclusive, scalable solutions, thereby accelerating Dasra's vision of a transformed India, where a billion thrive with dignity and equity. With you today, Dasra celebrates its 22 years of pioneering an approach to shaping collaborative philanthropy, which has new players, tremendous innovation in a changing landscape. Regardless, Dasra's work is guided by a strong belief in prioritizing the lives of vulnerable communities, trusting and respecting the wisdom of local, homegrown nonprofits, and leveraging the power of trust-based networks to build social capital with a gender, equity, diversity, and inclusion lens. Dasra now thrives on two core capabilities: leading collaborative platforms and catalyzing proximate philanthropy towards Dasra's mission, collaborative action to accelerate social change. Since 1999, Dasra has strengthened the social sector talent pipeline with over 350 Dasra alumni, fundraised more than $280 million, supported over 1,000 diverse nonprofits across the country, and affected the lives of over 90 million Indians. We need a philanthropic revolution and a bold ambition. By 2030, Dasra aims to raise $1 billion and affect over 500 million lives. Join us in this urgent call to action for a billion thriving. The nation needs you. Bharat needs you. With that, please welcome all of you to today's session, and we'll quickly start with a video. Thank you.
At the crossroads of great change, we are faced with a need for great resolve. To challenge the challenging, to build a resilient world for tomorrow. And while we remain rooted to the realities of our communities, today the systems we create, the conversations we hold, actively question these realities and make space for change. Because for a billion Indians to thrive, we must relook at our realities as fluid, our potential for change as flexible and interconnected. So this year, we are coming together to embrace that potential of transforming communities through a convergence of perspectives and continued action that rebuilds the future with resilience.
Welcome once again, everybody, to Around the World in Intersectional Ways, exploring layers and practice. If the world is to move towards real and sustainable change that really leaves no one behind, we will need to move beyond development laboratories and trigger actions in the real and messy world we all inhabit, where people's vulnerabilities are not the result of one episode or a singular identity, but is compounded by their multiple identities, relation to their selves, their family, and the state, and many more intersectionalities that account for who they are, what holds them back, and what needs to be addressed in order to make the change that is desired. It is this sentiment that was encaptured in the term intersectionality that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And Dasra was very privileged all of last year to be a part of a program supported by Robert Bosch Stiftings on reducing inequalities through intersectional practice, along with 11 other organizations across the globe that focused on this for a whole bunch of sustainable development goals. In today's session, we will travel vicariously through our screens to learn how intersectionality translates into practice by speaking to some of our fellow cohort members. But before that, I want to show you a brief glimpse through a video of the very rich learnings that we were able to gather through our work in this space on poor migrant women workers by speaking with over 70 organizations, nonprofit organizations in the country and the communities they serve. May I request us to play the video, please?
जब उस टाइम मेन में एक ही बार तो होता है ना, तो उस टाइम पानी अगर नहीं होता तो खरीद के लेके आई वो कपड़ा वॉश करके, जिधर हम लोग नहाते मतलब कपड़ा फटे हुए कपड़े से एक बना के रखा घर के साइड में छोटा छोटा, उठ के हम कपड़े ओपन नहीं कर सकते, बैठ के ओपन करते, बहुत मुश्किल होता है.
டிரான்ஸ்ஜெண்டர் கம்யூனிட்டி வேலைனா ஒன்னு செக்ஸ் ஒர்க்கர், இன்னொன்னு பெக்கிங், அது ரெண்டு தான் ஆப்ஷன் எங்களுக்கு. அது பண்ணிட்டே இருக்கும்போது ஏன்னா நம்ம ஆளுங்களுக்கு பார்த்தா வீடு கொடுக்கறது ரொம்ப கஷ்டம். ஏன்னா வீட்டுக்கு கேட்டா வேலைக்கு 5000 எங்களுக்கு 10,000 கேட்பாங்க. அது ஒரு ப்ராப்ளம் எங்களுக்கு.
রাত 4টে বাজলে উঠে কাজ করতে হয়, সকাল 10টা বাজলে সেবা করতে হয়, রান্না বান্না করে গুছিয়ে খেয়ে আবার 3টের দিকে আমাদের কাজে লাগতে হয়.
Thank you. Our first speaker in today's panel to tell us a little more about intersectionality actually could not make it here because of a family emergency. And so we have her speech recorded for you and would love to play it. This is Deepa Pawar, founder and director of Anubhuti Trust, a member herself of the denotified tribes in India, who are one of the most stigmatized communities in the country. May I please request you to play her part?
सिर्फ किसी तरह की एक पॉवर्टी ढूंढने का, गरीबी ढूंढने का या बेचारियत ढूंढने का प्रोग्राम मेरे ख्याल से नहीं है. वो प्रोग्राम मुझे इस तरह का लगता है, वो पहल मुझे इस तरह की लगती है कि हमारा जो समाज का एक ढांचा है, जो एक पिरामिड बना हुआ है, जो एक बिल्डिंग बनी हुई है, उसके फाउंडेशन में कई सारे लोगों ने अपना कंट्रीब्यूशन दिया है. उसका फाउंडेशन बनाने के लिए लोगों के कंट्रीब्यूशन इतने हद तक रहे कि उनके एग्जिस्टेंस के सवाल खड़े हो गए हैं. तो किसी ने मेहनत दी है, किसी ने अपनी कलाएं दी है, किसी ने अपना इंटेलेक्चुअल प्रॉपर्टी दिया है. और ये जो समूह है वो बहुत ज्यादा जमीनी स्तर से आते हैं. मतलब ये समाज को बनाने वाले जो समूह है वो इतने ग्रास रूट से आते हैं जो कभी कभी देख के भी नजरअंदाज होते हुए हमें नजर आएंगे. तो मुझे इंटरसेक्शनलिटी इस तरह से लगती है कि इतनी सारी समाज के अंदर परतें हैं, लेयर है, लेयर इन लेयर बटे हुए हैं कि उसको ढूंढना, उसका खोज करना एक बहुत ही ज्यादा मतलब महत्व का काम है. या मुझे लगता है कि जिसके ऊपर आगे आके हमें बार बार विचार मंथन करना होगा, काम करना होगा. तो मुझे एक एग्जांपल यहाँ पर सूझ रहा है कि जिस तरह से एक गूगल मैप होता है, गूगल मैप के ऊपर जब आप आपका लोकेशन डालते हो, वो ऊपरी तह पर आपको एक जमीन दिखाता है जो ऊपरी तौर पे आपको नजर आता है. लेकिन जब आपको आपके लोकेशन तक पहुंचना है, तब आप गूगल मैप को उतना ही जूम करते जाते हो, वो लोकेशन को उतना नजदीक लेकर जाते हो, तब जाके आपको समझ में आता है कि वो लोकेशन के इर्द गिर्द या उस लोकेशन में भी कितनी सारी बातें या कितने सारे लोकेशन छुपे हुए हैं. तो मुझे लगता है कि क्या इंटरसेक्शनलिटी भी इसी तरह का एक मैपिंग है इसी तरह की एक पहल है जो हमें बहुत ही ज़ूम करके एक वाइडर लेंस से देखने की ज़रूरत है। एक और उसके अंदर भी स्पेसिफिक देखने की ज़रूरत है कि समाज के ऐसे कौन से अंग है या ऐसे कौन सी कम्युनिटीज़ है जिन्होंने लगातार मेहनत की है, जिन्होंने मूवमेंट किए हैं, आंदोलन भी किए हैं, आवाज़ उठाए हैं, अपने मांगे रखी है, लेकिन फिर भी जिनके फंडामेंटल सवाल आज भी प्रतीक्षा में है। तो आपके सामने कई सारे ऐसे समूहों के नाम जो है वो सामने आ जाएंगे। तो ट्राइबल कम्युनिटीज है, घुमंतु समुदाय है, अपनी अलग तरह से पहचान दिखाने वाले अपने विकलांग समुदाय है, और इसके अंदर भी मतलब एक ऊपरी तौर पे दिखने वाले जो समुदाय है उसके अंदर भी फिर से इंटरसेक्शनलिटी छुपी हुई है। जैसे अगर मैं अपने समुदाय की बात करूं तो मैं नोमैडिक ट्राइब से आती हूँ। नोमैडिक ट्राइब ऊपरी तौर पर दिखने वाला एक घुमांतु जनजाति का समूह है, लेकिन जब मैं इसके अंदर देखती हूँ तो मुझे इसके अंदर भी परतें नजर आती है कि यहाँ पे औरतों का प्रतिनिधित्व क्या है, यहाँ पे औरतों के सवाल क्या है, औरतों का मार्जिनलाइजेशन क्या है, यहाँ पे बच्चों का मार्जिनलाइजेशन क्या है, यहाँ पे डिसेबिलिटी का मार्जिनलाइजेशन क्या है, सेक्सुअल माइनॉरिटी का मार्जिनलाइजेशन क्या है। तो अलग अलग समूह जो उनके कम्युनिटी में जाके फिर से मार्जिनलाइज हो रहे हैं, जिनको दोहरी और तिहरी लड़ाई लड़नी पड़ रही है, इंटरनल फैमिली, अपने खुद के साथ, फिर कम्युनिटी के साथ, और फिर बाहर खड़े वो पूरे एक पिरामिड के साथ जो एक पावर वॉक पे चलता है, जो एक सत्ता संघर्षों के ऊपर चलता है। तो मेरे ख्याल से इंटरसेक्शनलिटी देखने का एक अच्छा गाइडेंस जो है वो हमारे इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन देता है कि वो हर अंतिम इंसान जिसको पता भी नहीं है कि क्या उसके अधिकार है, क्या उसको चाहिए, वो कहाँ से आता है, लेकिन डायरेक्टली इनडायरेक्टली पावर वॉक से और एक तरह के वर्चस्ववादी समुदाय से, पॉलिटिकल डिसीजन से, सोशल इंटरफेरेंस से, हर तरीके से वो इम्पैक्ट हो रही है, हो रहा है। तो मैं वहां पे यही बोलूंगी कि मुझे गूगल मैप का एग्जांपल बहुत यहाँ पे लगता है कि बहुत ज्यादा जूम करने की जरूरत है अगर इंटरसेक्शनलिटी की उन पड़तों तक।
I think have we lost connection, Ami?
Yes, it seems like Sonvi. We're just trying to fix that.
Okay, sure. Apologies.
इंटरसेक्शनलिटी से किसी तरह की
Sonvi, maybe we can proceed, and we can come back to Deepa's video.
Sorry, I'm back. If we still have time, can I share? Sorry, I dropped off.
Please, Priyansha, let's complete her thought and then we'll move on.
So sorry. One second.
इंटरसेक्शनलिटी में आते हैं पर्दों के भीतर अपनी गिल्ट निकाल दे कि वो उनके उस प्रश्नों के लिए वो खुद जिम्मेदार है। क्योंकि जब भी लोग इंटरसेक्शनलिटी में आते हैं, पर्दों के भीतर अपनी पहचान रखते हैं, तो हमें एक सोशल गिल्ट परोसा जाता है कि आप जो भी हो, आपकी पॉवर्टी हो, आपका बेरोजगारी हो, आपका लिटरेसी रेट जो कम है, आपका सोशल पॉलिटिकल रिप्रेजेंटेशन नहीं है, क्योंकि आप काबिल नहीं, आपकी कम्युनिटी काबिल नहीं। तो मुझे लगता है कि ये गिल्ट जो है ना, ये न्यूनगंड जिसे हम कहते हैं, कि वो निकालना बहुत ज्यादा जरूरी है। तो वो जब आप निकालोगे तब आप उनको ऑप्शनली कौन सी पर्यायी व्यवस्था जो है वो ओरिएंट करवाओगे, जिसका परिचय करवाओगे। तो अनुभूति करके हमारा जो महत्व का काम चलता है वो ये है कि इस तरह की मार्जिनलाइज कम्युनिटी जो गांव से कस्बों से आती है, आदिवासी करके अपनी पहचान बताते हैं, घुमांतु करके अपनी पहचान बताते हैं, वो कभी बंदर वालों का खेल दिखाते हैं, कभी वो भालू के बाल बेचते हैं, वो कभी अपने खुद ने बनाए हुए इंस्ट्रूमेंट बजा बजा के जो है एंटरटेन के माध्यम से अपना रोजगार देखते हैं। वो लेबर में है, वो विड़बत्ती पे काम करते हैं, यानी ब्रिक पिकिंग का काम करते हैं। ऐसे सारे जो समुदाय है जिनके अलग अलग स्टेटस है, कभी वो माइग्रेशन के स्टेटस है, अनऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर में काम करने के स्टेटस है, बस्तियों में रहने के, स्लम में रहने के स्टेटस है, सो कॉल्ड अनधिकृत जगह जिसे हम कहते हैं गवर्नमेंट की लैंग्वेज में, कि इलीगल प्रॉपर्टीज के ऊपर रहने के जिनके अपने स्टेटस है। ऐसे हालातों में हमारा काम है कि हम एक कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल लीडरशिप की परिभाषा से लोगों को अवगत करवाए। उन्हें पता होता है, ऐसे नहीं है कि अनुभूति जाकर उनको नई कुछ बात बता रही है, वो बिल्कुल परिचित है। लेकिन एक तरह का मॉरल बूस्ट किया जाए, एक तरह की संगठन के रूप में चर्चाओं को जन्म दिया जाए, जहाँ पे संविधानिक लीडरशिप की बात हो, एक कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल लीडरशिप की बात हो, मानवीय मूल्यों के साथ साथ मानव अधिकारों के बारे में भी हम बातचीत करें। मेंटल जस्टिस को लेकर काम करते हैं, हम मेंटल हेल्थ नहीं कहते हैं, हम मेंटल जस्टिस कहते हैं, क्योंकि मेरा मानना है, हमारी संस्था का मानना है कि किसी भी इंडिविजुअल के या मार्जिनलाइजेशन से अपनी पहचान रखने वाली कम्युनिटी के मेंटल कोलैप्सेशन के लिए जरूरी नहीं है कि हमेशा वो इंसान ही जिम्मेदार हो या वो कम्युनिटी ही रिस्पॉन्सिबल हो। तो समाज का एक कलेक्टिव एक्सपेक्टेशन और कलेक्टिव रिजेक्शन का जो फॉर्मूला चलता है, वो कई बार कम्युनिटीज को, कई सारी कम्युनिटीज और इंडिविजुअल को मेंटली थ्रेटन निर्माण करता है, मेंटली कोलैप्सेशन के स्टेज में वो लेकर जाता है। लेकिन वो बहुत इंजरीज निर्माण करता है, वो जख्म पैदा करता है। किसी का वंचित होना, दुर्लक्षित होना, ये उसके मेंटल, इमोशनल, कल्चरल, फाइनेंशियल, पॉलिटिकल, सोशल हर तरह के कंट्रीब्यूशन, रिप्रेजेंटेशन और लीडरशिप के ऊपर असर करता है। भूमिका थी और एक्चुअल लीडरशिप जहाँ पे डिसीजंस लेने हैं, जहाँ पे बातें करनी है, जहाँ पे एक तरह के बदलाव की ओर या एक्शन प्लान की ओर बढ़ना है, तो मुझे लगता है कि ये एजेंडा जो है वो बस एक मीटिंग नहीं हो सकती है, या एक कोई वेबिनार नहीं हो सकता है, कोई सेमिनार नहीं हो सकता है। ये सतत की चर्चा है, ये कंटिन्यूअस चर्चा है, और हमें बहुत ही ईमानदारी से, सेंसिटिविटी से ध्यान में रखना पड़ेगा कि ये प्रक्रिया के हर एक टप्पे में जिन लोगों के बारे में हम बात कर रहे हैं वो लोग इनवाइटेड नहीं है, वो लोगों को हमने आमंत्रित नहीं किया है, बल्कि ये मंच ही उनके है, ये मंच उनके हैं। तो वो किस तरह से उस मंच को लीड करेंगे, इसके फैसिलिटेशन का जो एक जिम्मेदारी होगा वो उनका होगा, जिनके पास संसाधन है। लेकिन एक्चुअल जिसे मैं कहूँ कि लीडरशिप और ये सारी बातें जो है वो इसी टपके से आनी चाहिए। क्योंकि एक एटीट्यूड भी होता है कि लोग बहुत गरीब है, लोगों के बहुत प्रॉब्लम है, लेकिन मुझे लगता है कि मुझे क्या मतलब, ये कई सारी थियरी पब्लिश्ड है कि जब भी लोग इतने मायने में वंचित और दुर्लक्षित होते हैं, तो उनकी वंचितता, दुर्लक्षितता समाज के सधनता में, मतलब पावरफुल और रिसोर्सफुल कम्युनिटीज के पास छुपी भी होती है। तो बहुत ज्यादा ध्यान देने की हमें शायद जरूरत रहेगी कि ये उधारी, ये क्रेडिट हम किस तरह से चुकता करें, तो शायद हमें फील होगा। नहीं तो वो बहुत ही सिंपथाइज एटीट्यूड जाएगा। मैंने पहले ही स्टार्टिंग में जैसे बोला कि ये फाउंडेशन डाला है ये लोगों ने, कहीं भी नजर घुमा के देखो आपको इनके ही चिन्ह नजर आएंगे। आपको अगर वो संवेदना है तो मतलब आपको नजर आएंगे। तो ये जो क्रेडिट है जो सदियों से चल रहा है, सालों से चल रहा है, वो चुकता नहीं हो रहा है। मतलब समाज का एक वर्चस्ववादी ढांचा इनके कर्जे में डूबता चला जा रहा है। तो बहुत ही ईमानदारी से वो कर्जा उतारना पड़ेगा, बहुत संवेदनशीलता से, एक प्रक्रिया से, जहाँ पे सोशल पॉलिटिकल विल की, डिसीजंस मेकर की, मूवमेंट कन्वेनर की, हम जैसे सारे लोगों का, हर किसी का रोल उसके अंदर है।
Thank you, Deepa. That was a most invaluable contribution, despite her not being here in person with us. Anna, I'd like to move to you and pose a question. Deepa spoke about, from a community lens, the lens of a practitioner and somebody who belongs to a community that is hidden in plain sight. But from your lens, as the foundation themselves, in your journey, what are the approaches and what are the learnings that you've gathered as you've worked on intersectionality? And before I hand it over to you, just want to introduce to everybody, Anna Dorothy Grass is Senior Project Manager at Robert Bosch Stiftung Foundation and has been one of our continuous champions in this global program on intersectionality. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Sonli. Thank you so much for the invitation. And yeah, it's very interesting that Deepa talked about the importance of the communities and really putting them into the center, because that also plays a huge role in our learnings. I'm really happy to share some insights about our journey with and to intersectionality. So the Robert Bosch Stiftung went through a fundamental strategic development process that started in 2018. And then we kind of relaunched our international work in 2020. And during this strategic process, we tried to find out if inequality could be a topic for a foundation like ours, and if so, which approach we should take. And what we were told by many experts, including practitioners like the Fight Inequality Alliance, for example, during this process was that if we wanted to work on inequality, we really needed to do it systemically. That means not only looking at the symptoms of inequality and trying to mitigate them, but addressing the root causes of inequalities. And to pay special attention to intersecting inequalities, because it is through them that people are really left behind. And in our eyes, these two elements are at the core of intersectionality, looking at intersecting inequalities and looking at power structures as the root causes of inequalities. And as a practical consequence, centering the perspective and the needs of the most marginalized. And coming back to the SDGs that are part of the conversations here at the Dasra Philanthropy Week, we have SDG 10 that emphasizes the need to tackle inequality explicitly, but at the same time, leave no one behind is very valid for all the SDGs. And the two elements of intersectionality I mentioned, looking at power structures and centering the most marginalized, is a promising approach to all the SDGs, I think. And when we started working on inequality with the ambition to do it systemically, we were confronted with the challenge that there exists the theoretical concept of intersectionality and also quite some information about it, but that we did not come across something like a checklist or a set of criteria on how to identify intersectional practice or organizations working intersectionally. And that is how our support program, Reducing Inequalities Through Intersectional Practice, was born. And we wanted to better understand how intersectionality is practiced around the world and how organizations are applying intersectionality to the very different contexts they are in. And we also wanted to offer a space for reflecting it and to learn together with us. And we started a close collaboration with Rana Sinjacella, who is really the heart and the mind of the program. The call we then set up with her was a very open call because our focus was not on a specific region or topic, but really on the intersectional approach itself. And I think the round of partners that is together today really illustrates the broadness of the scope. And this is another characteristic of the intersectional approach. It is applicable to all topics and always brings in the notion of leave no one behind, because it makes you think about the margins and about the voices that are so often overheard, whilst they should be at the center of initiatives to tackling today's global challenges, like inequality, but also like climate change or conflicts. And it also shows that inequality is a relevant dimension for other issues, like the ones I mentioned I just mentioned, but also peace and democracies. And they are all connected with inequality, and the intersectional approach helps to work at exactly these intersections and create an added value for more than one challenge. Intersectionality tells us that the world we are living in is complex, that the world and its structures from very complex identities, like also Deepa said, and these identities experience multiple privileges and also multiple marginalizations. And intersectionality helps us to accept and embrace these complexities, because with the intersectional perspective, there's just no way out. And during the program, we and our 11 partners from all over the world try to deepen our intersectional understanding. I do not want to speak for them and what they took from this experience. I think they'll, or the ones that are with us today will share some of their learnings, but I will try to share a little bit of what we learned through this program. So Rana, our program lead, helped us to create this journey really based on the needs of our partners. We spent much time in many video calls to get a feeling of where our partners stood and what would be beneficial for them. Pramada Menon joined us as the facilitator for these workshops and created them step by step. And Pramada always brought in a moment of magic when it was about bringing together what we heard from the partners and then creating a workshop that responded to their needs. And from our partners, we learned that it was always about the community, planning everything with the needs of the community in mind. Their conversations showed us that investing in communities in a trust-based way, that means supporting them in what they think is most important for them, can also be a very sustainable way of advocacy and policy work for a foundation, because the communities know best what they need and what improves their situation. And they will still advocate for these needs when we or another foundation has changed its strategy. And another aspect is about having many different perspectives participating and really allowing meaningful participation. At the very beginning of our learning journey, we came across the need for language justice and decided to offer English-Spanish translation throughout the whole learning journey. It sounds like such a simple thing, but I have to confess that it is not yet normal for a European foundation to think beyond the English language. And another thing we learned as a foundation is that we need to look at our own positionality and the power imbalances that are inherent to our existence. Maybe you saw the statement that Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, published yesterday after having received a donation of $10 million from McKinsey Scott. And in this statement, they write that, now I'm quoting them, that philanthropic giving exists because of inequality and exploitation, what makes their role as grant makers and fundraisers a radically political act. They say that they owe this money to their communities, particularly to Indigenous, Black and Brown folks, for the past and ongoing harms caused by the oppressive systems of racism, sexism, and economic exploitation. So that is not yet exactly where we as the Robert Bosch Stiftung are, but nevertheless, we learn to regularly raise questions like, who decides what for whom? Are we really the ones who should decide what the money is spent for? What right do we have on that? And also, how do we enter a space and how much space do we really need as a philanthropic actor? Whose expertise is valued in what way, and how can we make sure not acting extractively and just rely on our power, but to really shift power in every step we take? And for us, this has only been the beginning of a long journey that was triggered by our work with intersectionality. As you will see during this event, our partners are working on very different topics and in different regions of the world. But looking at inequality with an intersectional lens was a basis for very deep discussions and inspired manifold learning during the workshops and beyond. It showed us that you can work, for example, on tech-facilitated gender-based violence, on climate change, on the situation of migrant women workers, or of forced migrants from armed conflicts. And intersecting inequalities always are a connecting theme, and applying an intersectional lens helps to leave no one behind. And that is what makes intersectionality in our eyes so promising for all work related to the SDGs. Thank you. Sonvi, back to you.
Thank you, Anna. And can I just say, in this time and age where patient capital that focuses on narrative building, just facilitating cross-learning between such a diverse global community of development is becoming so rare. This was quite an opportunity for us. I mean, I can speak for sure that it would have been impossible for organizations working on labor on the one hand to speak to organizations working on climate, to others working on gender-based violence, all using the same approach, but with no idea that that is the case, had it not been for the program. So more power to you, and thank you for that. I would love to move into a deep dive of some of the programs that Anna alluded to, and really share with you through them and their work what intersectional practice looks like. It sounds like a pretty heavy academic term, but actually plays out quite beautifully to lay bare what really needs to be done for the most marginalized communities. Angela, I'd love to start with you and kind of ask you, your work on intersectional community-based approach for building peace in conflict-ridden urban communities. Tell us a little bit about that. And before I hand it over to you, Angela Franco Calderon is a professor and researcher at Universidad del Valle. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you very much for having me here. And I will ask you to share the presentation I prepared. Thank you. And I will share with you our experience with the Robert Bosch Seed Fund financed during 2021, called City and Peace, Intersectional Approach and Collective Action in the Brisas de las Palmas. It's an informal settlement in Cali, Colombia. And next, please. And I want to focus on first, where is this settlement and the context. Colombia is in South America, and Cali is in the southwest part of the city near the Pacific Ocean. And we received a city as one of the main cities of Colombia, a lot of population and forced migrants from the armed conflict during the last 30 years. So Brisas de las Palmas is a settlement with a high number of people coming from the rural areas as forced migrants who decide to settle there in public lands, but they are not recognized as a formal neighborhood, but as an informal settlements. So we have been working with this view of intersectionality and this lens for promoting urban planning in the settlement and the legalization process. Next, please. We understand the intersectional approach as a subject, a little study in urban studies. And this gap in scholarship that we found as researchers and practitioners became an opportunity to propose new methodologies for informal settlement upgrading processes, which we think are useful for other contexts in Latin America and abroad. Next. So what were our main goals in this project? First, it was building a methodology with an intersectional approach with the participation of the community of Brisas de las Palmas. Franci Mina was the president of the community board, and she was part of our team. The second one was supporting the Brisas de las Palmas inhabitants and strengthen their knowledge about habitat co-production. They were building themselves the neighborhood, but we were as universities supporting them in this process. And the third one was creating new knowledge on informal settlements upgrading from an intersectional approach. Next. What were our challenges in this new journey linking intersectional approach and urban studies? The first one was carrying out an academic project with expectations of the community regarding social assistance, which are very common when NGOs or the government come to work with them. So they were expecting kind of that assistance from us, but we were in a very different journey and with a very different approach. The second one was implementing the intersectional approach in urban studies through innovative strategies, and creating new variables and methodologies to implement that. And the third one was developing the best method to map intersectionality. I will show you more about this, and exploring the intersectional approach with children and young people. Next. We started with recognition and the work with the community through the most common categories for defining these intersections, like gender, class, and race. And during the workshops we developed with the community, we arrived to build our own intersectional matrix. On the left side are one of the exercises we did with the community, and the right side our matrix. If you can pass the slide, the next is bigger so we can see more. But we were working with focusing on a territorial peace building, and for that we create categories related to people as individuals and to the territory, that what it means living in an informal settlement. So we achieved to build this with 7 categories, and finding how to represent these categories in these intersections. For example, Francie, she managed the dining room. She's a woman. She's a forced migrant affected by the armed conflict in Colombia, but also she's a leader of the neighborhood. So all of these intersections were captured in our exercise of building these metrics with the community. And next, please. So we developed also a strategy to map intersectionality for the first time. This is a 2D model that we developed in the GIS software, where people gave us their insights and feelings about spaces for welfare and spaces where they feel oppressions, and what kind of oppressions and what kind of people. We were working with women, we would work in the LGTB plus Q plus community, and we were working with kids, with teenagers, exploring how they feel in the different spaces of the neighborhood, of the settlement. And we developed this model for 8 maps representing every category. And next. And now we are working on the 3D models to work with the community near, because these 3D models are more understandable for them. And we are developing all this mapping to show the municipality how they can intervene these spaces, taking in account in the intersectional approach we have been working. So this is impacting public policy in the legalization process. And next, I think I'm finished my time. Where were our 3 heights in the development of this project? First was having the capacity of building trust as university, as academy, and strengthen these ties between the community, the academia, and the local government that were not very strong. And we have been working with the 3 parts as 3 parts together in the legalization process. Achieving that, Brisa de las Palmas was selected as the first pilot for a legalization in Cali. So it was a very important result of how to apply research in a very real context and on public policy, and incorporating the intersectional approach in urban studies and informal settlement upgrading as the pioneers of this methodology. And next. And so this is our team at the university and at the neighborhood. So thank you very much for inviting me here.
Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you for that fantastic map, something to really take away. I would move to you, Paula, and Paula Simon is coordinator of the Women in Migration Network. How have you been using this approach for international migration policy, and especially to make women migrants visible within the global women's rights movement?
Yes, hello everyone. Well, first I want to introduce the Women in Migration Network. We are a global network which was founded in 2012, so this is our 10th anniversary this year. And we have members from different regions. They are regional networks, international organizations, national NGOs, all working with migrant women and gender non-conforming migrants. And they come from different sectors, from labor, human rights, migrant rights. So this is, we have worked since our funding with an intersectional approach and also a cross-sectoral approach. And we are focused on expanding right-center policies. We usually work at the global spaces of migration policies, like the United Nations. But what we want to include in these spaces is the diversity of women affected by migration around the world. And we want to amplify voices of women in international policy, and to change the mainstream narratives on migrants, and to focus on migrant women's agency, not victimhood. So this is how we work. And through our project that was part of the Bosch Stiftung program on reducing inequalities through intersectional policy, we were able to introduce the intersectional approach into international migration policy. We worked around the Global Compact on Migration, and to have the intersectional nature of migrants into account, the gender, race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, age, disability, migration status, and national origin of migrants to be taken into account. And we were able to be part of two work streams in the context of the UN Network on Migration. One work stream was the racial discrimination, and the other was on gender discrimination. And what we were able to do is, of those, at first, there were two separate and parallel work streams. And what we achieved is of these working groups to work together with an intersectional approach. So racial discrimination, gender discrimination were not two parallel concepts, but combined, and how these are affecting migrants. And also through our work, we achieved to make migration visible within the women's rights movement. And we achieved that by building multi-sectoral alliances on the intersections of migration, climate, labor, trade, and inequality. And one of our challenges was to include migrant women and gender non-conforming migrants into feminist organizations, to incorporate new voices from the margins, which are often left behind by white-dominated feminist movements on the global north. An example of this was the joint work that we achieved to do in a coalition with AWID, which is the largest forum or network of women in development. It's a feminist international organization. Also with Solidarity Center, which is an international labor organization that works with labor unions around the globe. With GATW, which is the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women, and with FLEX, which is an organization that works on labor exploitation. So together with these organizations, networks, we organized a series of dialogues on labor migration from an intersectional feminist approach. And we organized what we call the Feminist Fridays, conversations about labor migration from a feminist intersectional lens. And through this, we showed how there is a gendered and racialized nature of labor exploitation, which is experienced by migrant women, and especially those working in undervalued sectors such as care work and the garment industry. So this is part of our work in the realms of migration policy, global migration policy, and also global feminist movements. And then I know that there is a second question. I don't know if I should go ahead with my presentation or you wanna ask me something else.
Please go ahead, Carla. Please
okay, so well, we encounter different challenges in our work in order to include intersectionality in our practice. So the first challenge we encountered was that we found out that uncritical understanding of intersectionality leads to the tokenization of migrant women, and also an hyper-focus on individual markers of identity. So we realized that what we have to do is to understand the root causes of intersecting oppressions. So, for example, it's not sufficient to sit an indigenous migrant woman from Central America, for example, on the table where global migration policies are discussed. What we need to do is also to have her voice, that she's able to raise her voice to challenge mainstream migration policies that ignore historical structures of inequality, such as patriarchy, racism, and neocolonialism. Because we know that all these inequality structures are the real push factors that push women to migrate. Then we also encounter another challenge, which was how to close the gap of the local and the global. Because us being a global organization, we knew that it was fundamental if we wanted to put intersectionality into practice to have a bottom-up approach. So to build from the ground. So during 2021, we organized a series of 5 regional dialogues in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Europe. And we gathered 150 activists and organizations in these dialogues. These dialogues were not open to the public, but participants were identified and invited because we wanted to create a safe space for exchange and for them to really share their lived experiences and create networks among them. And these participants included self-organized migrant women, feminist organizations, labor migrant workers organizations such as migrant domestic workers or migrant sex workers, also LGBTIQ organizations working on climate justice, indigenous women, and anti-racist movement. So it was a very broad spectrum of activists and organizations that we managed to come together. And one of the achievements of these regional dialogues, one of the understandings or the learnings of this experience was that intersectionality it has to be context situated. So there are specific oppressions, multiple oppressions and power dynamics that operate in each region. And we had to understand them and to listen what is happening on the ground to understand these differences, these regional or national differences, local differences also, because intersectionality doesn't have the same meaning for in different spaces. So it has to be localized and contexted. Also, it is fundamental to have a bottom-up approach to build knowledge and to build from the living experiences of migrant women. For example, we heard from domestic workers from Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, working in the Gulf countries in the Middle East, and how they are oppressed by the kafala system, which is a sponsorship system that they live in almost slavery conditions. They cannot change jobs. They don't have labor rights. They don't have rest days. So these are very oppressive and exploitative conditions. Another thing we learned was from indigenous and African descent migrant women in Latin America that they organize to claim for racial justice. Also, we found out about the situation of trans migrant sex workers in Europe that are not recognized by the mainstream feminist movement in Europe. So these were some of our learnings from the different regions. And well, an important thing we learned is how the intersectional approach can make movement building to be more effective, because it opens us for participatory, inclusive spaces of different realities. And it also it's the basis for finding out opportunities for collective action. So, well, this is part of the learnings from our experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. And you bring up a really important point. And intersectionality is not an answer, but it's an approach. And it gives you a few frameworks and a few good questions, a few blind spots that are often present in all movements to acknowledge and kind of keep in mind as we build new ones. So it's more of an approach, and I think it has to be taken like that. I'll move to you, Eva. Eva Resse is Executive Director at Global Green Grants, UK. Eva, you're applying this approach to grant making for environmental justice movements. Could you speak to that, and also to perhaps intersectionality seems like a pretty deep dive and a pretty individualistic dive. How do you kind of use that for creating more equitable systems?
Yes, thanks so much for inviting me. It's been really a privilege to be part of this learning cohort with Boj and Dasra and others, and I'm very happy to share and keep learning from what people are presenting here as well. I'm going to keep it relatively brief because I have to move on in a few minutes, but I think it's important to say that within the grant making world, there are obviously different approaches to grant making, and Green Grants Fund is a participatory grant maker supporting grassroots environmental and climate justice actors globally. So we are set up to be responsive and led by communities in our decision making. I think that makes us a little bit different from maybe others, but some of the experiences that we've also heard from Anna, we also really share. The other thing I would say as a sort of starting point is that environmental justice is by definition intersectional, because we're looking at the intersection between the environment and human rights and social justice. So as a grant maker, I think we have to be really careful and intentional to not silo these very interconnected approaches through siloing funding, right? If we only funded environmental issues, we would be siloing a very important part of the work. And if we're only looking at social justice and not understanding how environmental issues intersect with it, we are also siloing approaches again. So we're forcing grantees into thinking about it as projects rather than interconnected work. So the question for us is then, how do we center those intersecting and different experiences of environmental degradation, of environmental injustices and inequalities? So, you know, as a participatory fund, our decision-making is guided by lived realities, by the work of the grantee partners through our advisors, who we work with, who recommend grantees for funding. And they're all part of movements and the movements that we want to support, and they have this lived experience of environmental injustice. And that's a practice that has evolved for us, that has nuanced with time. We didn't always have a really clear analysis of it. I think for funders who are working in more traditional ways, there are some connected challenges. But if you're not working with a model like ours, how can you learn to understand the language, the analysis, the practice of those you seek to support? How can you bring those voices more into your decision making and into informing your decision making? So that's, I think, a really important question that the grant making space is grappling with more and more. I would also say that, to that bigger question, for us, a starting point was to look at power experiences and dynamics. So looking at how structural inequalities are impacting people, but also informally and more intimately, which is where sort of the structural and the individual comes in, and how that influences the experience of environmental justice and environmental protection. So we're looking at different forms of oppression and how, if we focus on those, we can understand the different and intersecting identities and demographics better, and then go deeper into that. So, very concretely, the same systems who are exploiting natural resources are also exploiting people. So if we understand that and understand those connections, then we can address those systemic drivers more effectively in the kinds of grants that we give. For us, that started off as a journey looking specifically at gender and the nexus of women and climate, women and environment. I saw the question on why is this work focused on women. I think there's a lot to say about historical oppression that would help us understand why the focus has been on women in this work. Partnership is another really important recommendation that I have for other funders. Partnering with also funders, other funders or other actors from other spaces who are interested in intersectional approaches, that has been key for us. We've been partnering with women's funds for a long time to work with each other to understand this intersection more. But also more recently, we've been partnering with the Disability Rights Fund and other disability actors to deepen this work on people with disabilities and their experience of environmental injustices. So there are many different approaches into it, but I think even just a thought partnership is a really great way to start. For us, ultimately, and I'll end with this, it's understanding how we can be a better supporter of environmental justice movements through understanding more holistically both the individual experience of these intersecting inequalities and the systemic oppressions that underlie those environmental injustices. And we do that by being led by the people who are experiencing these injustices. And we do that with a lot of intention to respond to those realities of people and communities rather than forcing work into silos. So those are just some really, starting points for other grant makers who might be in this audience. And I'd love to talk more about it. Unfortunately, I do have to leave now, but please, for the organizers, if you can share my email address, I'd be very happy to connect with anybody. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Eva. And I cannot stress enough how important the point of non-siloed grant making is. There's a reason that development across the globe is projects and not woven into the fabric of the communities, right? And to deprojectize it and make it a lived reality that will sustain beyond the funding and the support, as I see in the question out there. It has to be very much be led by the complexity of the communities that go through those changes and then kind of lead them. Thank you, Ivan, and please by all means exit if you want to. I'll move on to you, Isha. Isha Meher is senior researcher at End Cyber Abuse. You, in fact, are using this approach for technology-enabled gender-based violence. Tell us a little more about that and your learnings around it.
Thank you so much for having me here, Sonvi and Team Dasra. Before I begin, I would like to start with a tiny disclaimer and a tinier note of gratitude. sometimes, coming from a policy background, coming from a legal background, we do tend to slip into languages or jargon that are extremely technical. And then we realize our own folly, saying, we went down a very, very narrow road. And I personally tend to do that a lot. So I will begin by saying that if at all I happen to use words and terms, then do know that that is not an endorsement of the organization, and it's just a personal way of getting technical. And of course, feel free to bring it up in Q&A, or Sonvi, feel free to interrupt me and say, Isha, that's not a normal word, just use another one. So, and secondly, of course, I do want to thank both Dasra and RBS from the bottom of my heart for making something like this possible. Coming towards the end of the speaker lineup, one realizes how much commonality in difference one shares. Like I could say, and I'd possibly try making references to all the points that are extremely relevant for all of us, yet we happen to work in such diversely different fields. So thank you so much to both of you for making this happen. As you mentioned, Sonvi, that at End Cyber Abuse, we are a collective of lawyers and practitioners focused on looking at tech-facilitated gender-based violence. Now, how do we really describe an intersectional approach onto a phenomena like that? It's complex, but if I had to put it in a single sentence to begin with, I would say it entails an acknowledgement of the fact that one size does not fit all. It entails an understanding of the fact that definitions exist within the ingrained context of society, that ideas of intimacy, modesty, harm, and its manifestations, they vary deeply across cultures and countries, and sometimes, even within social groups inside a country. And we at ECA, along with our partners Chen, have been thinking and working to introduce an intersectional and survivor-centric lens to looking at technology-centered violence. Paula mentioned, I believe, that there is really no handbook or guideline that tells you, you do these 4 things and that's it, you're intersectional. It's an approach. It really is not a list that can tell you the right way. So our project, which is called Orbits, again, graciously supported by Robert Bosch Stiftung, it produces an end product, which is a field guide of creating law, research, policy, and technology, and looking at it, like I mentioned, through an intersectional and survivor-centric lens. Now, what does this approach entail? What we have come up with is a broad, loosely structured framework of certain principles. And we believe that having these principles present in policies can really take you a long way forward. Principles like equity, principles like agency, where you're simply recognizing the individual agency of the person concerned. Another one being decentralization of decision-making, or something that I believe one of my predecessors was mentioning, the element of power redistribution, that we acknowledge that there are certain centers which hold a huge amount of power just by being. You don't really have to act or do an overt act to hold that kind of power. So to acknowledge the decentralization of decision-making. Further moving on, we have principles of accountability, wherein as tech companies or as certain stakeholders, you realize that you own an element of accountability to the larger people you service or the people who you are responsible to. Elements of privacy, safety, plurality, and hope. I could go on and on elaborating on each one of them, but understanding that we have 2 more questions and this is a conversation, maybe I could flesh it up more through the subsequent questions.
Sure, thank you. And if you could tell us a little bit about the challenges and highs that you've experienced while working on this, that would be great too.
Yeah, I mean, it has been challenging, to be honest. And what is really interesting is, as I was listening to the speakers before me, I could say that there is not a single challenge that I'm going to tell you here that everybody else in the room would say, whoa, I didn't think of that. It's possibly so common across the board, and yet it remains a challenge, which is quite something to think of. It's quite a commentary on the structure of society as a whole. When we come from a law or a policy perspective, I think the key or the biggest challenge, the elephant in the room, is really to define something, to categorize something. And when we're talking about something like tech, there's a huge pace issue. By the time policy zeroes in on a problem and decides to define it and categorize it, tech has moved forward. It has evolved to add another dynamic to, let's say, the offense at hand, or the principle or the phenomena happening at hand. So the challenge of definition it's really a multi-layered one. One is, of course, the time lag. Second is, of course, something like, as I mentioned in my last answer, it is so varied across time and space. Let's say we've had this particular issue of defining an intimate image. What even isn't? I'm sure we have 70 odd people in this room, and I doubt even 60 of us would agree on a single definition saying, this is what's intimate. But let me play the devil's advocate. When you're a policymaker, can you really leave it up in the air? You can't. You have to zero down on a certain degree of defining it, categorizing it. And that's a double-edged sword right there. The second challenge that we faced is something that I believe Kana from the audience was mentioning, that once again, when you are a maker of law or policy, in law, you've historically been taking the reasonable man standard. And I realize the irony that lies in the term itself. The prototype that we base our solution on or our definition on is unfortunately that of somebody at the center of society, somebody who's often privileged, somebody who's often the most generic example of that member, which means that we end up inadvertently excluding those at the margins. Deepa mentioned the Google Maps example, and that had really been playing in my head throughout, saying, how do I really put that phenomena within this larger conversation? Which part of society do we focus on at the cost of zooming out of which other correlating part? So automatically policy excludes a section of the group of people. And it's just unfortunate the way it is. One can strive, one can make sure that one is being inclusive, one is being aware of the certain sections that policymakers generally leave behind, but that's pretty much about it. The other one, which is particularly very relevant in the Global South, I'd say, is the whole morality-laden discourse. When we work on something like tech-facilitated abuse, and you have people coming up to you, you have survivors coming up to you saying, this is what I went through. The standard response of law enforcement or state or whoever is holding power is, so you did do it, and the existing amount of power dynamics that lie there, what do you even say? I mean, as an individual practitioner, I've been practicing law in India for a few years, and sometimes my clients tell me that, you come to the police station with me to lodge the FIR, and I know why they're saying it. So the whole morality-laden discourse, the lack of legal aid, the lack of sensitization or understanding from the part of law. And lastly, of course, lastly on that point, this is important, so I must probably say it, that the other end of the sword is over-legislating, that you go to the society, you go to the lawmakers and say you're not doing enough. You are given such broad laws that end up censoring speech. It's very relevant in course of what we are going through in India today, that your bodily autonomy is criminalized, your free sexual expression is criminalized. So you really don't know where on that delicate thread should you stand.
And what keeps you going? What's the high of doing this?
I think this would be a question for each of us in this room, isn't it? What keeps us going? The high, there are many, though I shouldn't paint a rather cynical picture saying there are no highs and all of us just do it for the goodness of our heart. We are supported. I mean, I must say the team at ECA is extremely motivated, and they are very good people, like the ones I'm surrounded by here. But apart from that, what keeps us going is small victories. To say that there have been, once we do zoom out again and look at other comparative jurisdictions. 5 years ago, if you and I were talking, I would give you a lot of plate loads of cynicism to say we could do all of this better. And during the drafting of the Orbits field guide, we'd have a lot of feedback saying, give us more examples. What are more good practices? And I could tell you that we couldn't find enough, but the reverse side of that is we could find some, and that matters a lot. And that's the half full glass for us, that we look at other jurisdictions which have enacted laws, which acknowledge this difference. We have, Australia, who's had the Enhancing Online Safety Act, which has expanded the definition of intimate image to consider cultural, religious undertones that lie within it. We have, I believe, Canada and Australia again. Australia is like my favorite tech safety country almost at this point. So we have both Canada and Australia who've made it who've removed the barriers to accessing the law enforcement portal for victims, which has made it possible to register complaints in an anonymous way. And most importantly, these jurisdictions have recognized the fact that you can possibly have non-criminal remedies, non-criminal approaches in which you can have your problem resolved through mediation, through arbitration, through alternate dispute mechanism without really going through the stigmatized, complex, convoluted, and traditional criminal law way. So what keeps us going is definitely this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Isha, for that thought. I think that focus on the human being at the center, right, and looking at things from their angle. But Ami, I'll ask you, and bring you in. Ami Mishra is a team lead at Dasra and led the work that is done under this program on intersectionality. You've been working, through this lens on poor migrant women workers, Ami. What have been the key learnings, and how do you even bring this lens to bear on a country of over 1 billion people, where half the population is female?
Thank you, Sonvi, and I'm excited to share what we have learned. But to begin, I will have to start with the personal and reflect on my own experiences. I was once a migrant woman worker when I moved to an unknown city at the age of 24. The identities that I carried with me were that of belonging to an upper caste, middle class family. I am heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied, young, educated, and skilled. While I faced certain minor setbacks with regard to moving as a single person, I had the information, resources, and freedoms to live a life with access to safe accommodation, clean water, healthy meals, and was even able to afford some luxuries. My monthly income was predetermined. I was a taxpayer with my work counted in the system of national accounts. My own experience as a migrant woman worker is a stark contrast to the majority of the women in this country. Data shows that 70% of India's internal migrants are women, but the reason cited for migration is marriage. And does marriage mean that women aren't working? The data also tells us that the female labor force participation in this country is only 21%. But is this data really representative of women's working realities? Women in India spend 84% of their time doing unpaid work against men who spend 80% of their time doing paid work. In India, we see women working all around us, and yet they remain hidden in plain sight. Coming back to your question, when we discovered all these realities, many of us from privileged backgrounds are able to live with the freedoms that we have because of the labor of poor migrant women workers. However, we still don't acknowledge their work as work. Sometimes we call it help. Over the last year, we engaged in an immersive learning journey with practitioners, experts, and community-based organizations, where we tried to listen, reflect, and discern. We wanted to learn what intersectionality meant in the context of poor migrant women workers, because we already had a portfolio on informal workers. And we wanted to find out how NGOs in India are applying this approach on ground. We kept asking ourselves questions like, how do we articulate these learnings so that they're widely understood without reducing them to essentialism, which some of the other panelists before me have also mentioned, that it's very difficult to codify something like intersectionality. We also asked ourselves, how do we tell these stories without objectively, without misappropriating anything? Because we also had to understand what our position was. These were hard questions and we didn't always have the answers, but we kept revisiting intersectionality as a framework. Using the prism of intersectionality helped us see the lives of poor migrant women workers with all their layers and identities. From socio-demographic categories to lived experiences, we were able to see their lives as multiple, layered, complex, and surrounded by power relations. In India, tribe, gender, sexuality, class, religion, and other identities play a determining role in how women migrate, the work that they undertake, and the realities they experience. For example, waste picking is still primarily undertaken by women from lower caste groups. The peculiar division of labor through the caste system continues. This line that a practitioner told us has actually stayed with me. She said that when we don't segregate, women from lower caste communities have to make an occupation out of our toxic waste. Tribal girls from certain parts of Northwest India have the freedom to migrate independently to bordering areas, but not without safety concerns. Similarly, when families migrate seasonally between districts as agricultural laborers, women's work is considered as begar or unpaid. Large farmers use their help in attending to household chores, and they make them do it for free. So we conducted a workshop with grassroots organizations, and poor migrant women workers actually joined us live in this workshop, sharing their perspectives with us in 5 regional languages. We listened to them with patience, even though some bits were probably lost in translation. We were able to co-create an agenda and set a direction forward together with 12 on-ground practitioners. We collated recommendations for key stakeholders. In this workshop, we also collectively mapped the migration routes that women take, layering in details of how women's identities and lived experiences play a role in determining the ways in which women migrate. For instance, women from the Muslim community actually migrate with their families permanently. They could be migrating permanently between Indian districts and between rural to urban areas as well. At the same time, we saw that tribal women, young tribal women, could migrate independently on a circular basis. So we saw many such examples where identities and lived experiences played a big role in determining migration patterns. From these learnings, we were able to visualize poor migrant women workers in the mainstream, an articulation that hasn't been done so far. We created personas to articulate who these migrant women workers are, where they came from, what their stressors are. And we feel that the importance of creating these personas was that data-driven narratives were not doing justice to portraying women's lives. So the knowledge product that we have launched today actually tells you the stories of personal narratives and experiences of women. And this participatory knowledge building exercise actually helped us see women as embodied, heterogeneous, living among intermingling domestic, personal, public, and professional spheres, much like many of us here. We also developed an understanding of on-ground interventions with poor migrant women workers and deep dived into how these were implemented in intersectional ways. Through our conversations, we realized that intersectional practice actually begins with a sincere acknowledgement that there are differences and that those differences manifest as discrimination. If we had to build an intersectional program in the nonprofit sector, we can't compare the vulnerabilities experienced by different kinds of people. We can't say that layers 2+1 is more marginalized than layers 1+1. Let's leave that kind of calculations to the politicians of this country. But intersectional practice is about factoring in the social and material realities of poor migrant women workers throughout the program cycle. So when we started our learning journey, coming from an advisory background, we tried to break it down into a 2x2 grid, and we failed miserably. And finally, we arrived at an understanding of intersectionality that is well-rounded in the context of these women. Our framing of intersectionality now is a diagram of the universe where several different coordinates intermingle into a chaotic yet linked system of power dynamics. And we saw some questions in the chat. Along the way in our work, we realized that we cannot restrict ourselves to cis-het women. So we did try to include different kinds of identities within our circle. You can actually check out our knowledge product to see that. In terms of good practices, let me take you back to the example I shared about women migrating with their families as farm laborers. So there is an organization that is presently negotiating terms with large farmers to ensure that tribal women workers who are working on these farms and supporting the farming family with domestic duties get wages separately from their partners for the work that they do. Similarly, we know of another organization that is working with denotified and nomadic tribes to spread awareness about gender-based violence among contractors and in informal workplaces where the workplaces is not even defined. Another organization that we know is actually working on doing leadership development among Dalit and Muslim women by training them in using multimedia tools so that they are able to express themselves. The possibilities are endless, and it's time that philanthropy and industry take the lead in strengthening some of these solutions on ground and transform the inequalities faced by migrant women workers. In our program through the year, what we have tried to do is that we haven't put these different practices into neat categories. We've in fact created a tool that celebrates the diversity of practice that exists on ground. Like Isha mentioned, we don't have a list that tells you that this is what you must do. We weren't able to do that. We actually have a codification of intersectional practice that doesn't deflect the nuances. These good practices have been assembled by the different participants who took part in our workshops and who we communicated with over the last year. And it's just a means for different practitioners to reflect on their own practice. So also this tool is something that you don't have to use only once. As feminist thinker Audre Lorde said, revolution is not a one-time event. So we would encourage you to constantly reflect and use such a tool to actually see how programs can be made intersectional over a long course of time. So far, we've tried to tread with humility and openness. We have kept reflecting on our role as a nonprofit intermediary. We have tried to pass the mic and not give ourselves credit for it, because this is the bare minimum that should be done. We have tried to become intersectional across processes, from working with partners ground up to vendor selection to making technology more inclusive. Because at the end of the day, we implemented this project in the midst of a pandemic where the world was socially distanced. We've had to accept the weight of our privileges and share these opportunities that we get equitably. At the same time, we've had to leverage our privileges to make sure that insights about intersectionality and the lives of migrant women workers reaches industry, philanthropy, and other stakeholders who are part of their journey. For us, at the center of intersectional practice is constant reflection, course correction, weaving in inclusion in every action. So that's the sort of approach we've taken. Thank you.
Thanks, Ami. I'd love to open it up for questions, although there's been a vibrant Q&A on the chat already, but the platform is open in case you'd like to unmute and ask a question. Right, do keep it coming in. And I'll try to summarize, I think, as we head towards the end of this session, what I, as a novice to this, have imbibed from the very rich practice and perspectives that all the speakers have shared today. I think as development becomes not just development, but the lived reality of people in a country, it is going to become important for us to include the people who are going to go through the most radical transformation, to be included in this conversation of change. And for that, we need to start with making them visible, making their unique narratives heard, and most importantly, understood, and to quickly pass the baton then on to them to hold their agenda and frame their agenda and lead their way. And with that comes the need, I think, like Ami, you mentioned, for humility. And as many speakers mentioned, about a participatory approach and a reminder to ourselves every time, at every level, be it at the level of nonprofit organizations that work down at the community level, or communities that respond to these minority populations or conflict-ridden populations in a certain way, or to the governments that are trying to frame policy, that are we really including them in their unique perspective in what we are framing for them, or to sort of promote their agenda. So this is actually a call to action to all stakeholders out there, whether you're business, whether you're philanthropy, whether you're the state, whether you're narrative builders, movement builders, or merely community, merely is a bad word, community-based organizations that are responding to the need of the organizations. Keep the intersectionality approach in your mind, keep it human-centric, and learn from those communities so that we can challenge our assumptions and what we assume is right right sort of path forward. I think that is going to be a big change to how we try to accelerate the global movement towards Sustainable Development Goals 2030, and don't feel like it was anticlimactic, because as soon as we hit 2030 and this momentum kind of comes to its sort of official culmination, things shouldn't fall back to where they were. It shouldn't be because something pushed funding into it, or something pushed the narrative in a certain direction that we saw some perceptible change. It should be change that you can feel in the pulse of a community, and hopefully lives longer than the tenure of our programs and of our work. And if we do not have any questions, I'd perhaps call this to a close and thank all our speakers for your incredible time. I'd also like to thank the expert practitioners and organizations who enabled our learning journey by sharing their knowledge and intersectional practices, and partners of the support program of reducing inequalities through intersectional practice under the Robert Bosch Stiftung Foundation's program. Thank you very much. And we are going to move on to a feedback poll to get your thoughts on this particular panel. Thank you and have a great day ahead.